歴史の過ちを学んでいないとは。
レイス王によって世界の記憶を奪われたのは悲劇だ。だから何度も過ちを繰り返す。しまいには壁の中の奴ら全員、年寄りから子供まで特攻させるんだろうな。
どうせ誇り高き死がどうとか言い出すとふざけやがって。粉々にしちゃったか。何やってんだ俺。何マジになってんだよ。お前は父親とは違うだろ。何事も楽しまなくちゃ。みんなを誇り高き肉片にしてあげようぜ。
二発目来るぞ。撃て。
Before I start discussing the topic of Zeke Jaeger and this video in general, I'd like to briefly talk about what led up to my decision to even consider choosing such a controversial title, as well as what made me decide to tackle such a heavy character hated by many of the fanbase for rather obvious reasons. I read the Attack on Titan manga after watching season 1 of the anime during my first year at university back in 2013. After finishing the first season of Attack on Titan, which would actually be my first major anime viewing ever, I instantly jumped into the AOT manga, and at the time the manga was, I believe, around the chapter 45 mark, though I could be horribly mistaken. During the time of this reading, however, I found a strange fondness for the Beast Titan, most notably due to its unique design and its ability to speak. Coming back to the manga years later, in 2017, at around the time the Mali arc had just started, I developed some weird appreciation for Zeke and his character in general. It's no surprise to the community on my channel that I love villains and underdogs in all forms of media, but for some reason on the 2nd of August in 2017, I made my first ever Attack on Titan video, which was titled Is Zeke Jaeger a Villain? And looking back on it now, I'm honestly surprised at the time, and even now, how decent the reception was, given it being my first proper video and having no connections to any of the SNK community at the time. Simply a video sharing my thoughts on reading the manga and catching up at that point. Since then, I've also made a video talking about Zeke's master plan, which ended up being right for the most part, not to sound big-headed, and I've also very heavily discussed, debated and defended Zeke over the past year and a half within my own community on Discord and live streams, and even on occasion online forums. The reason for this backstory is to make it clear that I do have a personal interest and love for Zeke's character, and that by coming clean about this up front, I want to assure people that this analysis is going to be as unbiased as feasibly possible. This character analysis video will not contain fanboyism, and neither will it end on a note defending Zeke Jaeger. Quite the opposite, in fact, as I'm sure you'll see as I discuss his character at length. However, to answer the statement of this video from the get-go, no, Zeke Jaeger did not do nothing wrong. He did a lot wrong, in fact. But with this in mind, perhaps we can dive into his story and better understand what led up to his current situation in the manga, and why perhaps we should take a second look at his character and journey, instead of writing him off as a simple bad guy or typical villain. Ladies and gentlemen, let's dive right into Zeke Jaeger Did Nothing Wrong, an analysis. To begin with, I'd like to briefly talk about how moral ambiguity and the concept of good and evil has become a complex topic of discussion when debating a majority of the characters within the SNK manga. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the majority of characters within our main cast are hardly the perfect representation of a heroic group of people setting out on an adventure, but naturally this was never the premise or point of Attack on Titan from the offset. It's extremely difficult to analyse any character without first understanding that each and every one have at some point done questionable things for what they deem as the greater good or purely out of self-preservation. The scale between characters and their choices and decisions range from outright narcissistic indifference to one of hope and opportunity. How you interpret these decisions is rather subjective, but I'm going to try and dabble into this regarding Zeke Jaeger's character. While one could rightly argue that the main cast on Paradis were forced into their current predicament without any choice, in contradiction to the warriors who had the freedom to join the warrior units and become Titan shifters, it would seem that Izayama intentionally gave us a backstory for characters such as Reiner, Annie and Zeke to present that while that freedom of choice was always there, it was never really an option to begin with. The point I'm making here, or trying to, is that so many people instantly look at Zeke as the guy that killed Owen Smith and dismiss him as an extremely heartless and vindictive individual, yet fail to also bring forward the negative and morally questionable actions of other characters as a result. Zeke's list of crimes far outweigh that of many others, there is no arguing this, but that doesn't make Zeke an overly heartless and contrived villain with no redeeming qualities. Looking back over the manga as a whole, the only two characters that can arguably be referenced as good people who generally have done nothing irredeemable are Armin and Jean. These two characters have continuously showcased a desire to protect and save those around them, no matter who they are, with as little bloodshed as possible, while still retaining their humanity and hatred for such actions when it happens. Recent examples could also include Falco and Yankapon, I guess? Agueno? I'd also mention Sasha, but she's dead, and Connie, okay. Essentially, every character within this manga has a reason behind their actions and why they find themselves evolving and developing as they do throughout the story, and how they respond as such on both a moral and written level. Many people think Levi is rather stale and cliche as an overpowered character, but also fail to bring up his backstory in the underground and his journey as a whole. Levi's lack of empathy and emotion is heavily linked to the amount of loss, suffering, and his personal experiences that he has been through in his 30 plus years alive. Just like Zeke Jaeger's lack of empathy and complete dedication to his one singular goal of euthanasia is linked to his childhood story and the conflict of interest and purpose that he undertook. I hate to sound contrived, but if you think that Levi is a good guy but fail to understand how characters such as Reiner and Zeke have redeeming qualities, then you kind of miss one of the bigger points addressed since the Mali arc was created. On the other end, if you also fail to realise how Levi has faults and that of course Reiner and Zeke have faults, then you're also missing the point that I brought up at the start of this topic. There is no wholeheartedly good character here. Just like Izuyama hasn't written a clear-cut cartoon villain, rather people that make choices based upon an understandable yet immoral goal. Prime example being Zeke. Zeke Jaeger is far from a good person. Levi Ackerman is also far from a good person. But what truly sets Zeke apart from everyone else, including Levi of course, in this department, is his lack of showcasing his morality. What truly drives home the lack of morality in Zeke Jaeger is of course his upbringing and childhood. I'd argue that while Reiner had a pretty shit time as a kid and dealt with this in a more emotional way, Zeke almost closed his emotional connection off as a child with other people and never looked back. A lot of this emotional trauma and connection is due to a number of factors. Firstly, him growing up in the Liberio internment zone and being treated like an animal by the Malian populace. Second, the mixed messages and propaganda forced upon him by both his grandparents and his parents. And lastly, the lack of having any real emotional bond with his parents or anyone on any level that wasn't fueled by an agenda. But due to a culmination of these issues alongside other factors, it's evidence that Zeke never really connected with anybody on a personal level, with the exception of the one person that ever treated him like an actual person, Thomas Xavier. The experiences and arguably trauma of Zeke's childhood follow him into his adult life, as is showcased numerous times in the manga. The sad truth about Zeke's morality is it doesn't exist, and that Zeke is potentially the same trapped kid he was back in Liberio, only pushing onwards with this one goal and objective, regardless of the consequences to himself or those around him, and having had no real purpose prior to deciding to inherit the Beast Titan. Zeke promises Tom that he will save the world, and as I've already stated, Tom was the only person Zeke had connected to, and this bond is evident throughout the manga, with Zeke going to any measure to carry out this promise. The only other person that Zeke connects with on a moral or emotional level is Eren Yeager, and this is also related to his childhood, Zeke likely wanting to connect with Eren because of his parents and how his childhood played out. Either Zeke is looking for acceptance and belonging through Eren, or at the very least pushes to create a relationship that he was deprived of with Grisha and Dina. In the flashback, Zeke, as I've already stated, continuously attempts to make his parents proud, yet falls short every time, helping define the person he became. Eren could be seen as a form of escapism from that reality, though it's worth mentioning that Zeke's plan for Thomas appears to take priority first. You might think I'm fluffing up Zeke quite a lot here and being rather one-sided, but don't worry, later on in this video I'll be tearing Zeke a new but until then, let's continue. Izuyama has a thing for bad parenting, or lack of parents in some cases. Parental figures have often been used to push certain characters and their narratives forward, including Reiner Braun, Historia Rice, and most notably Eren Yeager. Zeke Jaeger is without a doubt one of the most pivotal when it comes to both influence and character development here. To truly understand how detrimental this is for Zeke and his character, we're going to have to go back and take a quick look at Grisha and Dina. Grisha has to be one of the more tragic characters in the manga, and yes, I am quoting my Grisha Jaeger analysis, but that point still stands. Grisha's upbringing and hatred for Malians due to his sister's death at the hand of Sergeant Gross, who is arguably the catalyst who set the ball rolling. Shit.
お前らエルディア人をこの世から一匹残らず駆逐する。 これは全人類の願いなんだよ。
Not to go on a tangent, but I will be bringing up Gross later also. Back to Grisha and his motivation and mindset. Grisha is justified in his mentality and thought process during the time you spend with him in chapters 87 and 88, but as he himself later realises, he was foolish and naive to put these ideals and his own purpose upon his firstborn son. Tragically and poetically, just like Grisha's father had fed him a history of the Malian perspective, so too had Grisha fed the Restorationist perspective to Zeke. The unfortunate truth for Zeke, though, was that as a child, he had to deal with two conflicting sides of history from both his father and his grandfather. With both sides of history being shown to him, Zeke had the potential and ability to realise, unlike most, that history itself was skewed and based upon the person writing it, just like Aaron Kruger states. The problem here, however, is that Zeke's timid and socially awkward personality, coupled with the conflicting sides of history being routinely drilled into his mind as a child, with no release or ability to vent, clearly takes its toll on him. The one and only respite Zeke had as a child from this nightmare was his baseball games with Tom Xavier, and it's likely the only time Zeke has ever had any sense of enjoyment or passion for anything in his whole life. This is exactly why his Titan and the way he handles it is a direct reflection upon his baseball skills. Zeke's attitude to having fun while killing the Survey Corps wasn't because he enjoyed the act of killing, it's because he's putting passion into the one thing he enjoyed and was good at doing: baseball. This to me is why Zeke acts extremely childish and even strange after his rant regarding Carl Fritz and the walls.
さあゲームセットわかるか投げ方を変えたんだよ
You may or may not have noticed the same situation with Annie Leonhardt. During the female Titan arc, we see Annie pulverizing the Survey Corps and almost taking pleasure in doing so. This again isn't the act of killing, it's her showing off her prowess and skills at the one thing she's competent and good at doing: martial arts. Annie is an extremely introverted and socially awkward individual who was raised by her father alone and was drilled in the arts of physical combat. While initially detesting her father for forcing her into this, she comes to embrace and even enjoy showing off these skills when she has a chance to do so. This, just like Zeke and his pitching skills, are why they appear to be enjoying themselves when committing gruesome and unforgivable acts of violence. If you really wanted to push it to the extreme, you could argue it's their way of making light of a dark situation and treating it like a game rather than the true reality of it. Though again, that may be pushing it. It's clear that like many of our other casts, Zeke is a product of bad parenting and influence to a certain degree that sets him on his current and ongoing journey within the manga. I'm not suggesting that Zeke has a split personality disorder or anything so obscure, but I wouldn't be surprised if he showcased symptoms of such disorders, as we will see in a minute. Zeke continuously shows frustration and difficulty in controlling his anger when referencing his childhood, and has been shown to break down and act out of character at points when recalling his father and finding out about his brother for the first time. As a kid, Zeke saw how naive Grisha's plan was, and also how insane it was to become a Titan shifter for the glory of Marley, something Thomas also agrees and acknowledges. People assume Zeke followed in Thomas's footsteps to die a glorious death, which is a half-assed excuse for dismantling his euthanasia plan. Zeke never became a warrior for Marley, and never once had any agenda that wasn't his own from the moment he inherited the Beast Titan power, and has continuously showcased nothing but perseverance in this regard, even risking his own life for the slim chance to see it through, not to off himself. Even facing death, Zeke is fueled by his plan to save the world, and it's the last and final thing he can speak about before his body begins to shut down. While Zeke definitely has a few screws loose upstairs, his dedication and determination can't be ignored. Zeke's plan for euthanasia is a product of being shunned and bullied by Marlians, understanding the Marlian perspective of Eldians, while also through Thomas and his own experiences, how Eldians across the world will suffer and continue to suffer until they're either wiped out by humanity or history somehow repeats itself with a new Eldian empire. We'll talk more about the euthanasia plan later, but with Zeke's maturity and adolescence, a clear shift from who Zeke was as a child to how he developed into maturity is evident. Zeke's growth from a vulnerable and scared young child shifts after his parents are taken to Paradis and Zeke is left in the care of his grandparents and of course Tom Xavier. It must be noted that while Grisha and Dina likely love Zeke in their own way, their own personal goals got in the way of that bond and human connection of treating him as anything more than a tool. This is exactly where Thomas Xavier fits in as a much more genuine and human individual. While there was speculation around the release of chapter 114 that Tom might be putting on a facade, looking back over these chapters, Tom Xavier appears to be a genuinely good person. who actually puts effort into making a difference and understands the stupidity of the warrior program and provides a clear, open-minded perspective when engaging in conversation with Zeke, treating him like an equal, going so far as to not even rat on Zeke's parents himself, but instead suggesting an ultimatum to save his and his grandparents' life. During these teenage years, Zeke's confidence has clearly increased considerably, and his attitude and personality reflect this. Eventually, when Zeke discusses the prospect of euthanasia with Tom, the comment of "if only I hadn't been born into this world" pops up. This is a perfect quote to present Zeke, Tom, and even Ryan's perspective on the world through their childhood and life experiences, whereas in contradiction to this, Eren Yeager believes he should live because he was born into this world. Eren contradicts his own statement as well as what he hears from Willy Tiber when he meets with Zeke in secret on Marley, clearly an indication that Eren likely doesn't agree with Zeke's plan, as it's the complete opposite of his own ideology. The baseball that Zeke hands Eren as a sign of trust is symbolic in this regard, as the last time we see this baseball is when Eren throws it into the air in chapter 98, only never to be seen again. If Eren dropped the baseball, then he has his own agenda, but if he caught it, he's still considering Zeke's plan. Likely the former one. Zeke's biggest downfalls are his arrogance, egotistical mentality, and genuine naivety in anything that he hasn't already learned or set his mind to. The concept of compromise is also something that Zeke appears to lack, and as I think is clear by now, all of this boils down to him being fixated upon achieving his goal of euthanasia and saving the world. Furthermore, despite having such a high intelligence within canon and managing to create and form his own personal group of loyalists over the years, all while deceiving his closest colleagues and even the readers, there is no denying that for some of the fans, this time could have been put to better use. Despite his plan making some level of sense, no matter how cruel and selfish it is, Zeke is still delusional and irrational in believing that he himself is able to make a decision so drastic on his own. Due to this, and what we've already explored regarding his childhood and emotional connection and discord with characters and himself, I definitely say that Zeke is fuel to forward his plan to such an extreme measure because of what he himself has decided is the truth of the world without actually having experienced it to its full measure. This is another issue with Zeke and his mindset, and his unwillingness to accept and embrace or even consider other options, or the possible concept of sharing his ideas. To counter my own point here, however, the reason for Zeke's secrecy and lack of trust in others is largely due to his backstory and childhood, though one could argue that's relevant in making such a big world-changing choice such as euthanasia. Zeke in this regard is arguably selfish, and even to some pathetic to some degree. To counter my counterpoint, it should be known that Zeke's level of secrecy is largely due to how his parents were close to being found out prior to Zeke's betrayal, so trusting no one but Yelena and keeping himself behind the scenes, much like the Owl, was the smartest thing to do. You could argue that Zeke Jaeger suffers from a god complex to a certain level, befitting given how characters such as Yelena and possibly other Jaegerists see him as. The fact that Zeke believes in his own personal ability to save the world and control the fate of Eldians, as well as his inflated feelings of infallibility, despite repeatedly getting his ass kicked or making rather stupid mistakes, are a showcase of this. Zeke's arrogance knows no bounds, and despite being a formidable and extremely intelligent character, his downfall isn't those around him, it's himself. This leads on to what we discussed regarding Zeke and his inability to communicate while having trust issues. Zeke, due to family issues and connections, has shared everything with Eren, though it must be noted Eren has the coordinate power too. The issue here though is that Thomas Xavier told Zeke to make sure the person who holds the founding Titan power is someone he can trust, since Zeke is simply the battery to fuel the coordinate and he won't be able to control what its choice actually is. Zeke and Eren's meeting in Marley showcased to me how Zeke blindly trusted in Eren's words, knowing nothing about him, in part due to him being family and Zeke desiring to save him from the same mindset that Grisha had attempted to give to Zeke. Many speculate this will be Zeke's biggest and ultimate downfall, being betrayed by Eren, much like Zeke betrayed his father before him, and also tragically showing that Zeke was used and manipulated by his family a second time around, and that his only real family was not of his own blood. That is pretty sad and tragic in hindsight if it does happen. Now that we have a better understanding of Zeke's morality, mindset and childhood, let's tackle his actual euthanasia plan. I like to point out ahead of time, I'm not saying what I think about his plan, but saying what we can assume Zeke would think from his perspective, as well as those on Paradis and the outside world. In a nutshell, Zeke has good intentions, but actions speak louder than words, and in this case don't justify the means. It's not the plan itself in concept, it's the execution that's the problem. Despite this, the cruel fact is, Zeke has a lot of weight to his argument here. The good old trope of villains being utilitarian fits Zeke rather well in this regard, in the fact that the action of euthanizing Eldians will will, at least from his point of view, in the long term maximize a more profitable and safer world at its conclusion. The sacrifice of the Eldian species will allow the rest of humanity to continue and thrive, and it will also, through Zeke's own ideology, benefit the Eldians across the world in controlled camps and zones to not have to have their children or grandchildren suffer the same fate as a result. On paper this sounds rather drastic, but as a generally viable solution, only it isn't. Now, without going into a personal stance on this, the reason this euthanasia plan is currently viable for some factions and Zeke is because it's currently the only logical solution that has been offered within the manga. Naturally, fans and readers have their own thoughts on better ways to solve the current conflict, but within the story itself, it has taken precedent as a much better solution than that of the Wall Titans decimating the world. With all this in mind, and as I originally stated, the euthanasia plan is preferable to worldwide destruction and the deaths of billions over millions, at least in the mind of Zeke. However, what Zeke fails to realise is he's deciding and acting on this without the consent or acceptance of a single person but himself, and that is why Zeke's plan is unethical, inhuman, and why himself is a villain. Yes, I just called Zeke a villain, mainly because his plan and actions are counterintuitive to the majority of the rest of the cast, so he's at least an antagonist to most. His utilitarian philosophy means that he'll do whatever it takes to see his and Xavier's plan fulfilled for what he deems as a better future. No doubt to some readers it is a better future, and I definitely see the fruits of this, as we'll discuss soon. If Zeke is willing to sacrifice thousands of lives, which doesn't resolve the purging of Paradis and its destruction, and leaves the current Eldians to suffer until their death, then his plan is extremely fallible, and it also portrays him as a villain. He is essentially playing God here, which fits his character ego and complex, and the way he's often portrayed and viewed quite nicely from a character standpoint. Zeke didn't set this plan in motion or inherit a Titan power for himself either. Thomas Xavier tells Zeke how ridiculous it is to want to be a warrior in the first place, so it's reasonable to assume he is putting the livelihood of the world before his own life if it wasn't clear enough already. Zeke may be well intentioned, but does he have the right to determine who should live and die? This makes him and his plan a great topic for conversation, and also a great antagonist to many of our characters. Other examples of big discussion with similar mindsets, albeit different goals, include Senator Armstrong from Metal Gear Rising.
America's disease, rotten to the core. There's no saving it. We need to pull it out by the roots. Wipe the slate clean. Burn it down!
And Thanos from Infinity War.
Because you murdered half the planet.
A small price to pay for salvation.
These are characters and villains we can understand and see sense with, despite for the most part disagreeing with their end goal and the actual way they go about doing it. There are some small points I'd like to discuss before we wrap up this video. Firstly, I mentioned in the first half that Zeke lacks morality, or at the very least puts it on hold. I stick by this, but as I stated even earlier in the video, I said that Zeke is not without redeemable qualities, and it's true. An example is in chapter 119, where we see Zeke show emotional frustration and even waits to listen and acknowledge his now deceased successor Colt in the middle of battle. Zeke is no fool most of the time, and here he realizes he could be killed at any minute, yet he still takes the time for Colt, both because of his understanding of family ties with Eren, alongside potential respect for Colt too. It's small and subtle, but it does highlight that Zeke isn't a completely psychopathic and inhumane monster, as some fans like to present him as. There is also his connection with his grandparents, and I'll admit there isn't much to work on here, but there was clearly more of a connection and bonding between them than there ever was with his parents, as seen from his childhood, at least. And I don't think I need to mention his brother or Tom in this regard either. Moving on, and slightly off topic, there is the conversation and monologue provided by Sergeant Gross to Grisha Yeager in chapter 87. This monologue is often overlooked for reasons I'm fully aware of, but if you take a minute to read it, it gives a great insight into the mindset of some, if not a good portion of Marlians across the world, and how they view and regard Eldians as inhumane and monsters. In chapter 94, we get a conversation between the warriors in Zeke's office, where they discuss that the world outside of Mali is considering removing human rights from Eldians. We also get a comment from Udo in chapter 98, where he explains that the camps and internment zones outside of Mali are considerably worse than that within Mali. This clearly paints a terrible picture that tells us the rest of the world has more hatred and disdain for Eldians than Mali, and if Sergeant Gross is an example of the Malian outlook on Eldians, then how much worse can it be outside? The point I'm making here is that if, as some readers believe, a peace will be brokered in the end, how will it ever amount to anything? Given a deep-rooted mindset that Eldians aren't even worth looking at as people, it seems extremely far-fetched and unlikely, and makes Zeke's plan seem even more logical. One thing to note here, which I probably should have said before, is that Zeke's plan of course affects the whole world, which is much grander in scale than what is going on the small island of Paradis, and that is whether you view Zeke's plan one way or another. Let's not forget that. Saying this, the recent exhibition by Izuyama points out through both his interview and the audio recording that we aren't in for a happy conclusion, with Izuyama going so far as to say he enjoys being hurt when reading stories as it leaves the biggest impact on him, and how he intends to finish the story as he had originally planned. Point in case, perhaps by the end we'll have wished that Zeke's master plan was the real endgame all along. In conclusion, I hope this video has helped you understand Zeke's character, or see him from a different perspective than what you had before coming in. This video was painstakingly fun to make, and is without a doubt rather controversial in comparison to my other content. I would have loved to have gone on a lot longer in detail about certain sections or pages, but I didn't want to draw the video out any longer than it needed to be. As a result, this is what you're stuck with. Thanks all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my second channel for weekly live streams, join my public Discord server to talk about anime, manga and other things, and follow me on social media to know when I upload content and go live.